When it comes to 5th edition module adventures, we get a wide bevy showing us a wide range of levels, awesome biomes, weird themes, but at the end of the day, there is a commonality to many of the 5e adventures in that the adventure is structured. This is a large departure from the origins of adventure modules, which had either locations and just some dressing along the side, or absolutely guaranteed structured environments. We've seen a large, wide array of what adventure modules are. My question for you all today is, does the modern adventure make us better DMs? Does reading and running these make us absolutely the awesomest DMs ever? Or do they actually make us worse? Does the modern adventure work? Or do you think that there is much more to be desired? Fred.
So for me, this question doesn't make sense.
Okay.
And I'll explain.
Okay.
Ultimately, I think there's a lot of different reasons why people run modules and pre-made adventures. But the key reason is usually time. Time is the factor, right? And you want something that you can run fairly effectively. You don't have to do all the homework because you simply don't have time because you've got kids and family and work and all that sort of stuff. So you're looking for a module or a pre-made that can do that effectively. I'm going to make it clear now that I don't think Wizards of the Coast makes those kinds of adventures. I think you have to look somewhere else. Yeah, I know there's going to be some people who are upset with me and so forth, but it's frankly a hardback copy book that's 250 to 300 pages. That is not easy to run. How much time do you have to spend to actually make that work? Oh my, it's way too much. Older adventures, 30 pages, 40 pages, and you're away. And they were really tight. Now, if you look at other publishers like Kobold Press, then they do a really good job because you get adventures that are like 1 page long, 4 pages long. There are other publishers doing the same thing. So it depends on what it is. In terms of does it make you better? As I said, I think the reason why people use them is time is the factor. I think you will probably be stronger at putting together a story and adventure if you can do it without any assistance. Okay, if you can do it without somebody presenting all that stuff for you, you're going through the trials and tribulations of actually learning how to do that yourself, and that's kind of how people had to do it initially. The idea of pre-mades and modules was something that was very, very popular in the early days because people didn't have to make their own dungeons now. They could use something that somebody else made. And they didn't have to spend a lot of time building their 27 levels of dungeon that they were going to run for their group because that was the rite of passage or whatever it was. So I usually use a mixture of pre-made to save time and homebrew. So I make my own stuff up as well and add that in. I think a lot of people do that. I think that's what they're doing. So they're using a mix. They've got a basic structure and then they make some adjustments to it. Might be small, might be a lot of adjustments. The kind of pre-made adventures that I use in terms of a structure are so short, like 1 page. You know, prepared 2, the Book of Lairs that Kobold Press put out, that like 4 or 5 pages. There's hardly anything to it. And I could run it as it is without any changes if I really wanted to, and I'd still be probably pretty fine. I don't know how they're able to make adventures that work that way, but they do. And I know other publishers can do it as well. Maybe not Wizards of the Coast. But the structure's there, and then if you want to build on top of it, it's actually very, very easy because they haven't made it so complicated that you've got to wade your way through all these pages to figure out how to make it work. I can take the monster, I can pull it out and put something else in there. You know, I can change the monster up if I want to. If I want to add in some NPCs or some different adventure hooks to work with my group and my campaign, I can. So I think doing the stuff yourself, I think you probably learn a lot more. But the reality is people use that not because they are trying to be better or worse at dungeon mastering. They do it because it's just a practical necessity of dealing with time.
Yeah, and time is honestly the biggest factor in all the world because time is money, and money's the real factor in all the world. Josiah, how do you feel about the modern adventure?
Yeah, agree with a lot of what Fred said. I think a lot of people lean towards pre-constructed adventures because of time, and unfortunately, that is a factor which exists and governs all of our lives. So it's a lot easier to do that for sure. I do think that reading through adventures has definitely made me better at making adventures, because whether the adventure is good or bad, you can still learn a lot from it, right? So like to use a personal anecdote, and something that taught me a lot was when I ran Curse of Strahd in 5th edition for the first time. That's a very long module. That's like a level 1 to like 15 module, I think, or 13. Um, and you run into this problem where it doesn't save you time, right? Like Curse of Strahd is it's a good module, but it does the opposite of what you think it's going to do. You think, oh, I can just go page by page, but then in reality, you're like, oh, I actually need to like read most of this book to figure out how it's going to work. That one especially, because there's so many moving parts and things that are like not the same every time you run through it, which is what makes it fun. But it also gives you an understanding of like, yeah, pre-made doesn't necessarily mean ready to go. It means that you have a textbook basically, right? Like, which, I mean, you can open and reference at any time, but you still got to do some homework to understand what's going on within it. Um, but it definitely taught me a lot, because running Curse of Strahd, there were certain things that I thought would be awesome that were part of the module that fell kind of flat with my players, and other things that I didn't think were going to be all that interesting that ended up being a big hit with my players. And by looking at that, I can see what like someone else's ideas are in action, and then how it actually works in practice, which is something that is invaluable to a DM if you want to start making your own adventures, especially your own long form adventures, right? Because like when you look online and you see like, oh, this adventure people don't really like that much, this one other people do really like, I mean, that's useful for buying a product, but it's also useful if you can take that and understand why, right? Like people don't love Horde of the Dragon Queen. That adventure gets a lot of hate from a lot of people, and I never really understood why. And then I read it, and I was like, oh, I get what some people don't like about this. That doesn't mean I think that that adventure is worthless. I think that it's great as like a learning thing to look through it and be like, huh, this is why people don't like this. So I think the most important thing when it comes to pre-made stuff is to keep in your mind that this was made by a human being or a group of human beings who are all fallible. No one knows everything about D&D. No one knows how to write like the perfect story. So if you keep that in mind while you're looking through, you don't have to take everything at face value. Like if you are set on running a module just because you think the story sounds cool, like you want to run Curse of Strahd because people talk about how it's a fun module, keep in mind that you can change literally everything about it if you want to, right? Like when we ran that module, we did it in like a pseudo wild western setting, and we swapped out a bunch of the stuff. So all the werewolves were weregators now and like that kind of crap. And like, while some of it is just reskinning, there were things that I was like, oh, this doesn't fit with the theming we're trying to do. So I like had to change up, and that's okay, right? I mean, how many books do we see on the DM's Guild that are like, hey, here's a supplement for this module that already exists to make it better, right? Because as talented as some of the writers are for some of these modules, you will never be as talented as the entire internet all coming out and coalescing like the best of the best ways to change it up. So I think that it's important to keep an open mind and to not take anything written just because it's Wizards of the Coast. Don't take it as gospel. Take it as, okay, this exists. What do I like about it? What don't I like about it? It's also important too to keep in mind something one group loves, another group might hate, right? Like you could run Curse of Strahd to the letter with 4 players and have them be like, that was the best D&D experience of my entire life. And then you could run it with 4 different people and be like, why did you make us do that? Right? So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of stuff. But in terms of like actually using adventures just as written, I do agree with Fred that the shorter ones tend to be more useful to DMs, because it's an espresso shot versus a giant mug of coffee, right? Like you get to see, okay, this is what's here, this is the meat, this is what works, this is what doesn't. You get that feedback right away. It doesn't take months of running through an adventure to learn what works and what doesn't. And then next time you're prepping a module in like 2 weeks, you'll be like, hey, that one trap from a while ago was cool. Maybe I'll do something like that. Yeah, that's generally the way that I approach pre-constructed modules.
Yeah. So if you ever get any pre-written thing, always change it up unless it's mine. If you get any of my products, do not change anything at all whatsoever. Flutes, how do you feel about pre-written stuff?
It used to be that I hated them, and I thought they actually made me a worse DM because there was a time I was working away from my family. I'd be at home on the weekends, and I'd be working and living somewhere else for 5 days. And to deal with that, I was like playing D&D with some people in that local area, but I didn't have a lot of time. So my friend lent me Horde of the Dragon Queen, as Josiah just mentioned, and I tried to run that. I'd read through it, and it was probably some of the worst DMing I've ever done. And I say that because I just didn't enjoy myself very much, and so that's good evidence that I wasn't doing very well. And so it made me worse, even though I was trying to run it by the letter. And I didn't really apply my experience with improv to try to like use it as inspiration, like Fred and Josiah said, and use it to as a building block instead of this is it. So when I gave another shot to Curse of Strahd and I was able to kind of put my own twists on things and not feel like I had to do certain things, I did a lot better. And if anyone is running modules and feels like they're kind of struggling, I highly recommend reading an article that Dragna Carta wrote on mine and Opal's website about specifically these 5th edition modules, because they're written like novels and not really like a true reference for a DM to enable you to save yourself time and run them. They're more supplementary to what you're already doing, and they'll give you as much as you want to take from them, but they don't really save you time, except for things like dungeons and those sorts of things. Maybe a little bit of time. And that article is really helpful. I highly recommend it. It also pointed out that many of those modules are not designed for being run, and a Pathfinder executive or something was quoted as saying most modules are not purchased to be run, they're just read. And that really surprised me, and I looked into it, and I started hearing other people say the same thing online. I looked in comments like, oh, I bought Rime of the Frost Maiden, and I really enjoyed reading it. I don't know if I'll ever run it. And I was like, wow, once I started looking for it, I realized a lot of people had that sentiment where they just enjoy reading it, and maybe they take inspiration for their own games. Like Candlekeep Mysteries is a good one because it's all one-shots, so you can run them as one-shots if you want, or you can just take pieces of inspiration into your own game and pretty easily like plop it in. So if you approach modules from the right angle, I think they can make your DMing better, because it's like you're just supplementing something that's well written out and presents itself in an interesting way. But it's not great for like an instruction manual in what to run. It's not great that way. And so I recommend them with that lens on. Otherwise, it might shoot you in the foot and you might be sad. But yeah, that's my take on it.
Shoot yourself in the foot, roll a deck save. You know,
Yep.
When it comes to the pre-written stuff, Wizards of the Coast a few years ago put out that they suspect that 50% of games are pre-written adventures and 50% are homebrew. So it is important to look at like, okay, obviously these pre-written adventures are hitting tons of people, but are people applying them as written? Are people that are brand new picking these things up? Are veterans picking these things up? You know, what is the underlying current here? Like, how do people approach these things? And I know that when it comes to new people showing up to D&D, those books are absolutely intimidating. You know, especially Curse of Strahd. Curse of Strahd being the most famous, epicest, biggest, adventure around. You know, that one gets a lot of traction online. And then all these new people show up and pick it up, and they're like, ugh, And I think to that degree, they are bad because they set up certain expectations that, oh, you got to read this book, you got to read all 300 pages of it, or, oh, you got to run it this way, or, oh, like it says it in the book right here, I've got to do this. And for me personally, I have a lot of it, my whole channel has been practically dedicated to these 5e modules. So I get a lot of people that show up and say, okay, like, how do I approach this situation? The book says this, but my players are doing that. What's going on? And that lack of malleableness to adventures, I think, is really bad. I think that what it comes down to is when you're making these 300-page adventure modules, they need to make them with the idea that players are going to ruin everything because that's what players do. And, you know, we see that all the time in these adventure modules that, oh, this NPC needs to give this to the party. Your party needs to get this one item. Your party needs to fight this one bad guy. But instead of, if we just replace the needs with the, this should happen, but, you know, something else could happen. If we just did that, then I think these adventure modules would be a lot better.
Having said that, one thing I want to add is that, and I kind of alluded to this in an earlier question, but to me, one of the keys to being a good DM for my style is to improv really well and have no one know that you're improvising. And sometimes using a module is kind of like this third party DM that's like off to the side. And so there's like this meta benefit of having a module where the group knows that there's a lot of content for them to interact with, and they trust that I know it very well and that I will improvise with whatever they do to interact with it. But there's still like all this content that they know I'm not improvising and that it is there. And because, and I really believe that that's a core value of mine with D&D. The more I think about it, is that there's a lot to interact with and it's not just an illusion of choice. And so that's like this meta benefit that I just thought of as you were talking. And so I wanted to throw that out there too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that especially too with the huge modules, like if you're determined to run a mega module like Curse of Strahd or something, I would love to see in the future more, or rather I would love to see in the future less of like what you were describing where it's like, hey, this NPC gives the party this NPC does this, as much as this NPC has this in their possession and here's like their motivations, so that the DM can be like, okay, well, based on what the party's done so far, is that person more likely to cooperate with them, or is that person more likely to withhold that from them and kind of give you a little bit more freedom, which is something I highly recommend you do when running modules. It's just you have to overcome the, like, especially something I see with a lot of newer DMs, like, oh, the players will hate it if I like mess up the story. It's like, there's no story to mess up, dude. Like, the story is whatever's happening. You know, it's not expected of you to keep something true to the module if you think that there's a better option for what your players want to do, right?
And what your players want to do is ruin everything, as always. I can't stress it enough, people. Players are the worst part of all of D&D. So tell me what you think about pre-written adventures. Are they making the hobby better or worse? Are they making DMs better or worse? Do you think that modern adventures are good for what they're doing? Do you think they're bad for what they're doing? And most important of all is, we know that for a fact that Wizards of the Coast has stated that they are going to do more anthologies. So do you think that anthologies are better to go? A little one-shots, two-shots versus, you know, full-blown 50-session campaigns? Go ahead and tell me those things, because I would love to hear it down below.